Alright, hi there, welcome to Mighty Maths. I'm going to be very quickly talking about the PTA cycle, which stands for Plan, Teach, Assess. Some of you might know it as Assessment for Learning and Assessment of Learning, or a formative and summative assessment. So, what is the PTA cycle? Well, PTA stands for Plan, Teach, Assess, in the sense of you plan a lesson, you then go and teach it, you assess it, and that informs your next stage of planning. I have just planned a lesson, well, planned it yesterday actually, actually planned it a few weeks ago, for shapes in in a key stage 1. So we're linking 2D shapes to their properties, so children are getting their names, then how many sides do they have, and then how many corners do they have, and this is investigation. Once they've done this, they've got to then use diagrams and sort out where the shapes go based on their assumptions here. So that's my lesson, so that's me planning my lesson. I have just taught my lesson. It has gone reasonably well, and now it's the end of the school day, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to assess their work. So if I take out one child's example, forgive the hieroglyphics, but this is year 1. Right, so I can see from their work that they have managed to pretty much identify all the shapes correctly. They know how many edges they have, or sides, because 2D shapes, how many sides they have, how many corners they have, and they've begun to sort them out. So I'm happy with his work. But that's one child. Obviously, I want to assess a range, top, middle, and bottom. Looking at another child's work, who's actually a higher ability group, same thing. They've managed to guess all the sides, all the corners, and begin to sort them out. However, when it comes to a circle, they know that it has one side, but they've got the amount of edges wrong. What they've done is they've noticed a pattern. So 3 sides, 3 corners, 4 sides, 4 corners. They've noticed that amazingly, but still got the circle wrong. If I check another book. Let's see. I've got the same problem here with the circle. They've noticed that it's got one side, but they've got the corners wrong. I choose another book. 2 seconds. Same thing with the circle. So this is me assessing my lesson, and it's going to go into my next stage of planning. My next lesson was to move on to 3D shapes. This was only a revisit for 2D shapes. However, I know that possibly in the introduction activity, I've now got to use what's happened in this lesson to kind of address their misconceptions, so my children don't recognise that a circle doesn't have any corners. So when I'm planning my next lesson, I'm going to factor that in, and then I'm going to teach it, and I'm going to assess it, and then this is the never-ending cycle. So that's what PTA is all about. You plan, you teach, you assess. Simple. Now this whole cycle, so the PTA, it is a form of assessment for learning, and I won't go too much into the depths of what assessment for learning is, but assessment for learning overall, in a broadish nutshell, is formative assessment. Formative, the way I remember it, is it's informal, in the sense of it could be a verbal conversation between me and my children, it could be peer assessment, it could be 2 steps of marking, it could be higher order questioning. It's something that is, what I'd like to think of it in a, again, very informal way, is very casual. And it's generally not measurable, which differs from assessment of learning, which happens in a definitive period of time. And this could be our SATs, our GCSEs, our SPAG tests, and that is a form, these all are forms of summative assessment, and I think of that as the summit of like a mountain. You get to the end. So summative is what you do at the end of a period. You do it as a snapshot in a moment of time. Normally we think of them as exams, handwritten exams. And the formative assessment, which is assessment for learning, which is our PTA, is something that we do continuously. You do it daily, you do it to progress your children, to scaffold them. So yeah, that was pretty much it. So that was just me very briefly talking about the PTA cycle. Alright, so why am I talking about this? Okay, so I have been on 4 teaching practices now, and these views are obviously my own and from my personal experiences. But what I've generally noticed about assessment for learning, it's a great tool, it's a free tool, it's one of probably the biggest skills that you will develop as a teacher. But what it can do is, or what it does generally I find, is build up the ability to reason, and the skills of functionality. You know, taking, not just with maths, but with maths as an example, taking, you know, abstract context, abstract context like this equation here and making it real, for example. So the A can suddenly represent apples and the B bananas, etc. And, you know, that for children is something, well, it's what we want from education. We don't just want them to, you know, be able to pass exams and then suddenly go out into the real world and have no skills whatsoever, which is kind of the downside of what I've seen for assessment of learning. What I've seen from that generally is that a lot of teachers fall under a lot of pressure, and we just teach children to pass the exams, which is fine. You know, as civil servants, as I've said before, we're accountable, and, you know, our attainment has to be measurable. Completely fine. But however, you know, as someone who's joined this profession, I've done it to impart knowledge into my children so they can take the skills that I give them into their adult life. And generally with assessment of learning, I have found that hasn't necessarily worked. And, you know, as a good example, you know, some people may disagree with the views that I have. That's perfectly fine. So if I give you the example, I had to, well, everyone should be able to relate to this. In order to get into this profession, we all had to undertake our skills test. Now, if I just learned how to pass that exam, which, you know, a lot of people have done, you know, you've got a few examples online and you just generally learn the skills that are needed, you enter that classroom with weak subject knowledge. And then what happens is, you know, you prepare a really, really, really good observation lesson, you pass that as well. But all I've done is just pass the exams here. And I'm then going to be left with a group of, you know, anywhere from one child in an intervention to a group of 60 children when I do a double teach. And I'm responsible for their attainment and their level of maths when I have no application of the functional skills. What I can do is pass those observations, and I can pass all the exams, and I can pass all the assessments. But as a general practitioner, I have no functional skills whatsoever. So this is where the danger of it really lies. But then when you've got assessment for learning, what I would have done is I would have revised for the exams, of course, but I would have applied it in many different contexts. I learned how to, I never got taught box and whisker diagrams at school. I've now learned that at school, I developed it, and I've also taught it in a lesson. I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't actually used box and whisker diagrams for anything in my life. But, or actually algebra. Something that I was very, very weak on at secondary school, and I've learned the skills, and now I could solve this equation. So obviously they don't match, so we have to make them match, and to do that I would times this whole equation by 2, so that would come 4a plus 2b equals 80p. And then what I would do really is actually place it on top of here, 4a, 2b, 80p, whoops, equals plus, get rid of this now, and then I would start to eliminate. So this now becomes 1a plus 0b equals 10p. So therefore I've now got the value of a. A is 10p, and when you plug in back the values, you now know this becomes 20p. So, whoops, that's kind of why I just wanted to speak about the dangers. Well, not to say the dangers, but just give you my view of assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and the whole PTA cycle, and how, you know, it just is something that I would really advocate for any teachers to use in any of their lessons, and it's also something that I just advocate for you and yourself. You know, these are things that before I started my PGCE course I wouldn't have been able to do, but it's because I've actually learned it in a broke format, so to some degree exam drilling or assessment of learning, and then I've also begun to apply it in a functional way and done it through a range of contexts, so then it kind of becomes AFL. So, you know, another thing is that the two aren't linear. They sometimes work hand in hand. As I said earlier, sometimes what we do in our exams, you know, assessment of learning, so our SATs, our GCSEs, our end of year tests, they will inform what we do at the beginning of the next year. So then that becomes AFL. So don't always think of them as two separate things. I've just demonstrated them as that for the sake of this video. So yeah, that's pretty much it, dudes. Peace out.